G'day everybody, how you going today? It is so good to see you. I do hope you are super well. In this video, we are going to discuss whether the brand new Z50 version 2 is a replacement for the D500. And I think for some people, it absolutely will be. Where should this story begin? And I think it begins with the pedigree of what the D500 was. Here on my right, your left, we have two cameras that are very closely related to the D500. We have the D5 and the D850. Now, the D5 and the D500 were announced together in January 2016. And it was about 18 months later that we saw the announcement of the D850. These three cameras share a huge amount of DNA. And what that ended up making the D500 was a very powerful camera. It seems to be, based on all the information that I can glean from my comments over the last 5 or 6 years, that a great deal of people who ended up using the D500 were action, birding, and wildlife users. And the reason that they were attracted to it, of course, is the D500, unlike the D5 and the D850, was an APS-C sensor. And what that means is, for example, this 400mm lens here, when it's on an APS-C sensor or it's cropped to APS-C, it becomes a 600mm lens, but it's still giving you 2.8, in this case, of light gathering capability. Or, for example, this 70 to 200mm lens, if you are shooting at the 200mm end of that lens, the field of view equivalent becomes 300mm. So for those trying to capture objects that are a long way away or not as far away but are small, and that is often wildlife and it is often birding, the D500 seemed to be the perfect sweet spot. Interestingly, Nikon's flagship at the time, the D5 that we can see here, was the same 20-odd megapixels, but it was full frame, so you don't get the same reach. And another curveball in all of this is that, well, the D850 that, as I said, came about 18 months later, well, it was kind of a hybrid of the two. It was full frame, 35mm, but it was 45 megapixels. And when you took an APS-C crop of that 45.7 megapixel sensor, it ended up being 19.4 megapixels. And a D500 was 20.9 megapixels. So the two cameras really had a very similar resolution, megapixels, pixel pitch. All of these things essentially mean the same thing. Nikon was able to use similar technologies when it came to hardware with the D5 and the D500, the focus system, among other things, as well as sensor hardware when it came to what can they do with sensors at that similar pixel pitch. It's a highly coveted camera because it gave you so much reach. But of course today, and with the arrival of the D850, it is a bit of a different story because you can have the best of both worlds in a camera like the D850, and that now translates to a camera like the Z8. The only reason you'd probably buy a D500 versus a D850 or a Z8, and now in this case I believe a Z50 Mark II, is the difference in cost. If cost was not really a consideration, I would definitely buy the D850 or the Z8 because that gives you a similar crop sensor, but it also gives you the capacity to jump to your 35mm sensor and get the other use case advantages of that larger sensor. In other words, you get the complete all-rounder and the best of both worlds. But, well, cost is important to a lot of people, and a Z50 is definitely smaller than a Z8. So why do I think the Z50 Mark II is maybe sitting in a similar position? Card slots. It is 2 versus 1 SD card slot. It's a UHS-2 version, but it is only one.
Another area of difference is weather sealing. Due to the Z50II having a flash built in, this does make the weather sealing a little bit different versus the D500. Now again, for hardcore birders who will find themselves in the rain and the wilderness, this might be an issue, but for more casual birders, well, weather sealing or a good raincoat for your camera might mitigate the differences. And also there is a clear difference in batteries. The Z50II has the smaller, lighter battery. The D500 came with the ENEL15. Very different batteries. We live in a different world today than we lived in the D500 era, where plugging an external battery via USB-C into your camera via an L-shaped plug allows you to have power into your camera with very little inconvenience. And this power, depending on the size of your external battery, in essence can just keep you running all day long. So yes, there is a difference in batteries. It's up to you how you choose to solve it.
If there's any other things I've missed, please do let us all know in the comments below. We all know that DSLRs were never as good at video as current mirrorless cameras are today. So I don't think most people are buying a D500 for video. As I said, these days, the people that talk about it, they are action and wildlife shooters. So we're going to be talking about focus systems, we're going to be talking about frames per second, we're going to be talking about sensor size, pixels, megapixels, etc. So the first thing that I think is really interesting about the Z50 Mark II and the D500 is that they both have the same megapixels. Yes, we have something like an 8-year gap between these two cameras, but Nikon obviously believes that those megapixels are the right sort of number for this sort of camera. And of course, we know with megapixels, it's always a trade-off between image quality, high ISO quality, and pixels. Now, some will say that that's not really relevant these days. I think at the end of the day, any gains that are being made by adding more and more photo sites / pixels and keeping noise down, that's actually being done with noise reduction in software. This is not a hardware advantage. And yes, we are seeing sensors today that are 26 megapixels, which is really a very small difference between, let's call it 21 because it's 20.9, very small difference in actual width between a 21 and 26 megapixel sensor. You're not really getting very much more resolution. And then we have some 40 megapixels. Now that equates to almost 100 megapixels in 35mm terms. That means the photo sites on those sensors are very, very small. So from my perspective, I will always argue that from a hardware perspective, if you want the best noise outcomes, then you will go with lower megapixels. It's as simple as that. And then it's a bit of a moving target as to how much of things that you can fix in post. We obviously live in the AI world now, and yes, I've said in the past that resolution and noise is becoming somewhat agnostic. In other words, what I mean is, as time passes and these algorithms improve, yes, we can shoot with higher ISOs and we can get better looking images. But there are some trade-offs. As we go higher in ISOs, we do get lower dynamic range. It's not as simple as just AI noise reduction. And I've talked about this when it comes to Nikon's 45.7 megapixel cameras, of which Nikon has many. Well, we're up to 5 or 6, something like that. Nikon seem to find a sweet spot in sensors that they think works for their technology, works for their customers, and is going to give you a great all-rounder outcome. And I think this is fair. Sure, you could push this camera to 26 megapixels. You could, but for the majority of users, in real terms, it's really quite a negligible difference. And I will stand firmly by that. It's like the difference between 45 megapixels and 50 megapixels. I know that's less. Or even the difference between 45 megapixels and 60 megapixels. On the long edge, it's only just over 1,000 pixels when it comes to the difference there. And when it comes to a 26 megapixel sensor versus the 20.9, let's call it 21 megapixel sensor, we're talking about a 600 to 700 pixel difference on the long edge. That's it. And obviously, if you put that in the center of your frame, it's around 300 or so pixels. That's it, on either side. From my perspective, it's not really worth the difference. And I would prefer ISO performance, especially if I'm a birding and wildlife photographer, because you're often in low light situations with lenses that are getting longer and longer and apertures that are getting smaller and smaller. But again, that's where it comes down to everybody's individual use cases. But people do talk about cropping, but let's keep in mind an APS-C sensor by default is cropping out of the box. And as I said before, this 400mm lens becomes 600mm and this 200mm lens becomes 300mm field of view equivalent. I think it's okay. I think it'll suit some people and it won't suit others. Now, the other really exciting thing about the Z50 version 2 is that it now shoots 15 and 30 frames per second in E-shutter. Now, that's JPEG, and again, that works for some use cases and not for others. Cool, though, at this price point and this size of body. But it does shoot 11 frames per second RAW with full AF and AE, and that is faster than the D500 that shot at 10 frames per second. So you're actually doing slightly better there. And if you've been super happy with your D500 doing that, well, you're going to be happy with going a little bit faster with the Z50. A massive difference and upgrade for D500 users is, of course, the subject detection modes, the autofocus, and for action and wildlife and birds, especially birders, indeed, this camera comes with Bird Detect. Now, that says to me it comes with Bird Detect because Nikon thinks some birders are going to use it. And here it is. And absolutely, because this is XPEED 7, it is working similarly to all the other XPEED 7 cameras. And from my tests so far using the AF, it is very snappy at recognizing things and it's very snappy in general. From an autofocus perspective, it is going to be a far more exciting and compelling and capable camera than the D500. Finding birds for you. That's cool. And this is why I've got all this glass here on the table. So, of course, you might say, well, we're living in the mirrorless era now. Why doesn't the Z50 version 2 have in-body image stabilization? Well, for the D500 market, there was never any in-body image stabilization for that camera. And if you are doing birding, pretty much every lens that you will get your hands on has stabilization. For example, the 70-200 in the Z mount, stabilized. The 400mm, both of them stabilized. All of these telephoto lenses from the new Nikon Z range and from the old F range, as we have here, all of these lenses are stabilized for this purpose. They will help you with birds not moving and your hand holding slower shutter speeds. And of course, as your shutter speeds get much, much faster, well, you don't really need stabilization when you're, say, at 1/1000th of a second. And there's another massive improvement that the Z50II gives you over the D500, and that's just video in general. You've got video that becomes more usable because you've got autofocus that is very, very usable. Plus, you've got autofocus that's got all the subject tracking modes, including Bird AF. Not only that, but we've now got 10-bit. Not only that, we've got access to log as well. And beyond that, we have the slow motion modes of 60p, which is cropped, which gives you even more reach beyond your cropped sensor. So from a video side, if you're a birder and you want to get good quality video, well, I can vouch for the fact that all of the current APS-C cameras in the Z range all shoot beautiful, wonderful video, which is up there with all of its full frame siblings. From a video perspective, you're going to get absolutely great results when you're doing birding. And look, that's sort of it from my perspective. You know, when it comes to battery life and all those sorts of things, well, in this day and age, you can have battery eliminators plugged in all the time, both running your camera and charging the battery at the same time. There's no issues there. I would say using an EVF actually makes a lot of these situations easier to shoot in because you can see more in lower light and you can see your exposure as you're going. Whereas with a mirror, you don't actually know what your exposure is. You've got to be looking at your light meter. And even then you can be tricked by highlights coming through a speckled tree of leaves and the light meter misunderstands what it's seeing and you get an under or overexposed result. An EVF won't do that because you are eyeballing what you're getting whilst you're getting it. I do think it has the potential of lifting the game for certain D500 users. It's a little bit faster, it's got much better AF, and you've got all of the advantages that XPEED 7 brings to this level of camera, along with access, of course, to the gorgeous Z glass. Now, you might say, well, Z glass is very expensive, I don't want to buy that. And that's fine, because as an F-mount user with your D500, you can continue to use all of your current glass with no penalty unless your lenses are so old, and we're talking the last ones of these lenses were released probably something like 25 years ago and still have the old screw style focusing system. Any lenses newer than that will work the same, if not better. We've found with some lenses that they actually focus a little bit faster. Like this lens here focuses a little bit faster on the Z9. I haven't tested it on any other mirrorless cameras of Nikon's, but it focuses faster on the Z9 than it does on the F5. You can bring over your beautiful F glass and you can upgrade to Z or not in your own time or not when you want to or not. So from my perspective, the opportunity to jump in and play with this mirrorless option, you're a D500 user and you want to start playing with mirrorless, then you can get in and start playing with a version of a D500 replacement, and all you need is the F to Z adapter and the body, and you're off and running because you've already got beautiful glass. Like, it's pretty crazy. Look how tiny that is on this enormous thing. I will do some more testing and come back to you as to how well I think that works. And I'll have a look in electronic shutter as to what the rolling shutter looks like. Certainly with the mechanical shutter, that mitigates rolling shutter. And I definitely love you to let me know if you'd like me to deep dive more into the potentiality of the D500 as a birding camera. It's not a massive leap. The idea that D500 users could mount lenses like the 200 to 500, any other glass that they've got from the F mount, and of course, any glass that they've got from the Z mount will work amazingly as well. Certainly not lenses as heavy as this. The problem with this lens on this camera, this lens is quite old at this point in time. It's very heavy. It's something like 4.5 kilograms. And of course, the camera's like half a kilogram, so it's not offsetting the weight like pretty much any other body would help you offset the weight. So it's quite hard to hand hold, but the results are there. I know there are other options out there on the market which have slightly more megapixels. I know 10 more megapixels sounds like a lot, but it doesn't actually mean that much in real terms. Like, to give you an idea, this is like 5.5. This is like 5,500 pixels wide, and this is about just over 8,500 pixels wide. So that's the difference between 21 and 45.7. So going up to 26 or 30. You're only going to get like 1,000 to 1,500 pixels, but you have to keep in mind the things that suffer, and again, I will repeat, ISO performance and also potentially rolling shutter when you're in electronic mode. And what we're seeing is some cameras, when they're in electronic mode, their image quality performance suffers as well. I will attempt to test that. But what Nikon have done with the Z6 III, and I'm hoping that it's the same with this camera, is whether you're shooting the Z6 III with a shutter or electronically, it gives you the same dynamic range and ISO performance. Yes, there's numbers. Yes, there's higher and lower numbers, but you've also got to look at the image quality that comes out of all of that. So I think the sensor is a sweet spot. Look, it could always be more for some. And that's why I said this is a D500 replacement for some people. Are you interested in moving into the mirrorless era, or maybe you're already in the mirrorless era and you just love the idea of having this pretty small, pretty fast with the XP7 autofocus and subject detection modes, along with a huge range of other features that comes with XP7 in this very small unit, which you can obviously throw in your backpack and take along with you when you're going on a hike and get some great action shots of birds and other wildlife. All right, let me know in the comments below. It's been so good to see you, and if this is your first time here, I'd love to see you again. So please subscribe, please share, and please like. All right, bye for now.